Hey, Gus, you guys ready to pick up now? Hey! Shut down fire in the cockpit!
For NASA astronauts, every mission is a matter of life and death. Today we delve into some of the last quotes from astronauts moments before harrowing accidents in space. Michael J. Adams was an astronaut who flew the X-15 rocket plane, a cutting-edge aircraft at the time. His last flight was on November 15, 1967. He reached an altitude of 266,000 feet, but when the nose of the X-15 veered off course by 15 degrees as he descended, the aircraft went into a dangerous spin. It was chaotic, with the plane experiencing extreme forces, over 15 Gs vertically and 8 Gs laterally. Just 10 minutes after launch, Adams announced, "I'm in a spin," before the X-15 broke apart, killing him instantly. After the accident, search teams tried to recover evidence from the wreckage. The cockpit camera was retrieved, which recorded the flight, but the film inside was missing. Eventually it was found though, allowing the investigators to learn exactly what happened during his final moments. Final ILS-24 was the last radioed transmission sent by Elliot See before he died in a tragic accident along with fellow NASA astronaut Charles Bassett. On February 28, 1966, an accident occurred at Lambert Field in St. Louis, Missouri. Elliot See and Charles Bassett were on a routine training flight of a NASA Northrop T-38 Talon. See was piloting the jet, and Bassett was in the rear seat, while another T-38 carried their backup crew, Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan. After taking off from Ellington Air Force Base in Texas, they ran into trouble. As they approached St. Louis, they missed their landing marker and overshot the runway. See tried to land on the southwest runway. As he descended, the plane dropped too far left, and he activated the afterburner to gain altitude while turning right. Unfortunately, at 8:58 a.m., the jet crashed into the roof of McDonnell Aircraft's Building 101, where the Gemini spacecraft was being assembled. The T-38 lost its right wing and cartwheeled into a parking lot. Both astronauts died instantly from the impact. See was found ejected from the cockpit, still strapped to his seat. Bassett's body was discovered later in the building. The crash also injured 17 McDonnell employees. American test pilot Michael Alsbury died in 2014 during a test flight, his last words being "pitch up" moments before the accident. On October 31st, 2014, the VSS Enterprise, a Spaceship Two experimental space vehicle, crashed into the Mojave Desert. The flight, known as Powered Flight 4, was the first powered test in 9 months and aimed to test a new hybrid rocket engine using nylon fuel instead of rubber. The VSS Enterprise was piloted by Peter Seibold and co-piloted by Michael Alsbury. After being released from its carrier aircraft, VMS Eve, the space plane fired its engine as planned. Just 11 seconds into the flight though, the Enterprise broke apart, creating a massive debris field stretching 35 miles. Witnesses reported seeing a parachute before the crash. Tragically, Alsbury was killed in the incident, while Seibold survived with serious injuries and was transported to a nearby hospital. Seibold managed to escape the wreckage and was parachuted to safety. It was a rare given the circumstances. He reported that the aircraft broke apart around him, but his parachute deployed automatically after he unbuckled his seat. In 1966, during the Gemini 8 mission, David Scott radioed to ground control after a seemingly successful dock, stating, quote, "Flight, we are docked. Yes, it's really a smoothie." Little did he and Neil Armstrong know that things were about to be the exact opposite of smooth. Gemini 8 was launched on March 16, 1966. It was going to be a historic flight, the first ever docking in space, where the Gemini spacecraft would link up with an Agena target vehicle. The plan was for astronauts David Scott and Neil Armstrong to spend 3 days in space doing experiments and a spacewalk. Well, shortly after docking, Scott and Armstrong noticed the spacecraft was starting to roll uncontrollably. Armstrong tried to stabilize using its thrusters, and it stopped for a moment, but then it started rolling again. Out of communication range with mission control, they had to make a quick decision. They realized that the high spin rate could damage the spacecraft or even cause the Agena to explode, so they undocked from it. But without the added weight of the Agena, the Gemini began to spin even faster. Unfortunately, they'd used up a lot of their re-entry fuel while stabilizing the spacecraft, so they had to cut the mission short and make an emergency landing. Scott later praised Armstrong stating the guy was brilliant. He knew the system so well, he found the solution, he activated the solution under extreme circumstances. It was my lucky day to be flying with him. On July 16, 2013, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano's spacewalk of the ISS was cut short when he reported that water was filling up his spacesuit. As he was working outside, water started leaking into his helmet. Total nightmare scenario. But not only was his helmet filling with water, but it was floating around and blocking his vision, made it hard to hear because of the weightlessness in space. Parmitano ended up spending just over an hour outside, making it one of the shortest spacewalks in ISS history. He later said, "I started going back to the airlock and the water kept trickling. It completely covered my eyes and my nose. It was really hard to see. I couldn't hear anything. It was really hard to communicate. I went back using just memory, basically going back to the airlock until I found it." Fortunately, he made it back inside the ISS safely, but the experience, understandably, left him pretty shaken. Charles Conrad famously described the Apollo 12 mission as, quote, "a small step for Neil, but a long one for me." And at no time was that more clear than when not one, but two lightning strikes hit the shuttle on takeoff. Terrifying. On November 14th, 1969, Apollo 12 launched from Kennedy Space Center at 11:22 a.m. Things were looking kinda ominous though. There were dark clouds overhead, heavy winds. I'd be uneasy getting on a plane in conditions like that, let alone a rocket heading to space. Just over 35 seconds into liftoff, the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning, causing a voltage surge that knocked out all three fuel cells, leaving the spacecraft to run solely on its batteries, which weren't powerful enough for all the systems. And then a second lightning strike hit 52 seconds into takeoff, taking out what's called the 8-ball attitude indicator. They were worried that the lightning might have affected the command module's parachutes. It was too late to really do anything about it though, so they just kept that information from the crew. Luckily, in the end though, the parachutes deployed just fine, and the Apollo 12 mission was a success. Theodore Freeman was an American astronautical engineer and test pilot who became a NASA astronaut in 1963. Sadly, he was the first astronaut to lose his life when his T-38 jet crashed on October 31st, 1964. On that day, Freeman was flying back to Houston after some training in St. Louis. The flight was delayed thanks to fog, which turned out to be partially responsible for the accident. Now, as he approached Ellington Air Force Base, a flock of geese was reported in the area. One of these geese struck the left side air intake of his craft, causing the engine to flame out. The engine out, Freeman tried to land on the runway but realized he was too low and might hit nearby military housing. So he banked away from the runway and prepared to eject. But unfortunately, because the jet was nosing down, he ejected nearly horizontally. His parachute failed to deploy in time, and he died on impact. Freeman knew the risks that came with being an astronaut though, and despite these risks, he was passionate for his work. To quote him, "We don't look on this as dangerous work. It's about the most fascinating job I could imagine. Too much pain. Do something please to kill the pain." These were the last words spoken by Valentin Bondarenko, a Soviet fighter pilot who was selected as a cosmonaut in 1960. March 23, 1961, he was on a 15-day endurance experiment inside a low-pressure altitude chamber in Moscow. The chamber had an atmosphere that was at least 50% oxygen, making it highly flammable. On the 10th day of this experiment, after finishing all his tasks for the day, Bondarenko removed some monitoring sensors from his body. Then he started using an alcohol-soaked cotton ball to clean his skin. He tossed it aside without thinking, and it happened to land on a hot plate he was using to brew tea. The cotton ignited, and when Bondarenko tried to put out the small fire with his sleeve, he caught on fire almost immediately. The chamber was under pressure, and it took nearly half an hour for a doctor to open the door to get to him. By the time help arrived though, Bondarenko had suffered severe burns over most of his body. He died from shock 16 hours after the accident. In honor of his contribution to space exploration though, a crater on the moon's far side was eventually named after him. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Kennedy Space Center at 11:38 a.m. 58 seconds into the flight, 9 puffs of smoke were spotted coming from the rear solid rocket booster. Cold temperatures had compromised the O-rings, which were meant to seal the joints, allowing hot gas to escape, causing damage to the craft. As Challenger continued its ascent, a flame burst through the joint of the booster, and just moments later, the right booster detached from Challenger, leading to a catastrophic explosion. Pilot Mike Smith's last recorded words were simply, "uh-oh," as the shuttle began to break apart. Debris scattered over the Atlantic Ocean. February 1st, 2003, the Columbia Space Shuttle, commanded by Rick Husband, was in the middle of its re-entry when it broke apart in the sky, killing everyone on board. The shuttle had sustained damage to its thermal protection system during its launch, which allowed superheated air to enter into the left wing, and this caused serious issues as the shuttle descended, leading to increased drag and loss of control. Around 8:53 a.m., the shuttle started shedding all this debris. By 8:58, the shuttle systems began reporting multiple failures. Just a minute later, communication with Columbia was abruptly lost. Rick Husband's last recorded words were a simple "Roger, before the connection cut off. Columbia broke apart in the atmosphere, resulting in the loss of all 7 crew. With all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.